get a couple books. And as you can look at it, go through the pages there. You can see this is not a long document. You're looking at it here, and notice how it's kind of set up too.
What was the original language of it?
Great.
Great.
Yep. And it was a document that early Christians used. I've got something I'm going to do here, but I thought I just would. Early Christians used, and it over time got mixed into lots of other things. And this guy, I'm going to put him up here. Let's see this guy. He's a bishop from. There you go. Philotheus Bryennius. I'm going to say it. I think that is probably saying that right. Philotheus Bryennius, who was born in 1833 and died in 1917, was a Greek Orthodox Metropolitan Bishop of Nicomedia, and the discoverer in 1873 of the Didache. And it was already, it was already in a bunch of manuscripts that people had just kind of gone by. And the thing that's interesting is that early church people referred to this document a lot, but they never were able to find the document itself. So Bishop Bryennius, found this document in the Jerusalem monastery of the Most Holy Sepulchre, which is located in the Greek quarter of Constantinople. My understanding is that it was there all the time. People were flipping through this old manuscript and not really understanding what they were seeing. And this guy was, I guess, trained in a certain way in terms of studying. And he flipped the page and he said, "Oh, what's this?" And I'm using, by the way, Todd recommended a couple of books, and I got this one by Thomas O'Loughlin, The Didache, A Window on the Earliest Christians. So all the stuff that I'm pulling here on the screen comes from this source. Todd has a second one I know that he's referred to me this week that I'm going to get. But I like the way O'Loughlin talks about this. He said this was a eureka moment for the bishop. It's the study of scholars' dreams and a plot of 100 films. A young library-bound academic turns over the leaf of an ancient manuscript, and there before his eyes is a lost text. And I'm not going to really talk too much today about why it got lost, but we will talk about why it got lost at some point. And it's important to know that people have heard about it and wondered about it. For forever, it's referred to, but without a doubt, it had been found. So this scholar's life, meaning the bishop's life, changed from obscurity behind bookshelves. He will become world famous. Indeed, the whole discipline will be changed by his discovery. Now, Todd, speak to that just for a second, without going into too much. Why would the whole discipline have been changed by his discovery?
Well, if you're studying early church history or even the biblical text, this was the earliest kind of book of order kind of text that the church had ever written, where it had been used in many places. But it had been lost. And so you would hear about the text referenced in other places, but without having the text in front of you, you didn't know why it was being referred to, what the significance was, and so forth. So on one issue, it's just, here's the earliest book of order, how the community was called to live, how individuals were supposed to behave, what worship was like. The second reason it's so important is its relation to the gospel. Most likely, this text predates Mark. Most likely. So there are some who think that it's a later creation. I happen to agree, just in my limited study, that it predates. So there are references in here to items that we will later see in the Gospels. So in other words, there was the common knowledge, an oral tradition at least, of how people worship God, what they did, what they said, what were the important teachings. So if you have this text so early that it even predates, it definitely predates Matthew and Luke. It may not predate Mark, but it definitely predates Matthew and Luke. That's really significant, because then you can better understand what Matthew and Luke are saying as well, and why they said it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, because you see the way it's listed. And we'll talk about it. It really, they were... they were trying to figure out exactly what it was. And so we're going to talk about it here. In 1873, what did Irenaeus find in this ancient handwritten codex? So here are some possibilities. A booklet used in the very first decades of Christianity. It's older than most of Christianity's most famous records, giving a completely new slant on how its adherents lived their lives, saw themselves, and expressed their beliefs. So this, I knew nothing about it, and as soon as Todd said to me, this could predate most of the Gospels, I said, whoa. And then when you read it, it's to me, I said to Todd, when we had breakfast last week, I said, it almost seems like possibly the Gospel writers had a crib sheet. This was the crib sheet. It could have been. Could have been. It is a short text and deceptively simple, but it will cause an earthquake that will shake 1,000-year-old certainties. It's beginning a revolution that changes the way a worldwide religion looks at its most august books and thinks about its origins. So that's kind of, it is revolutionary that way. Now the thing is, as you can imagine, it does create controversy. We'll talk about that in a second. The title comes from the heading by Irenaeus found at the head of the short text in the manuscript. So there it is in Greek. I'm not going to profess to know Greek enough to be able to pronounce that. And then the translation of that is the Lord's teaching to the nations through the 12 apostles. And that's a long title that I believe that was added later. It was just known as the Didache. And Didache is kind of interesting because you had a capital D Didache, okay, which is this document, and then you have the small d Didache, which is just the learning. That's the teaching part of it. Didache means the teaching. You want to add anything to
Just the title itself, Didache. The simplest reading is the teaching, and Mark also mentioned the learning. But there's another variable in the use of that word that's significant, and it could also mean training. And as we study this, you will see that this is a training manual. And it's highly likely that for the early church, and the author speculates that this text was to be memorized by someone who was going to be baptized into the faith.
Commit to memory. You didn't have it, you weren't supposed to pull it out and read it to see whether you're doing it. It's like you were living it, kind of thing. Yeah. Trying to figure out what had been found. So, is it a manual? When first found, this jumble of discrete items of information reminded scholars of later collections of church law. And so, scholars saw it as a very simple set of guidelines for clerics. So they call it a manual. Is it a set of how-to notes? A folder of useful information for early churches, is that what it was? Information that they found valuable on helping them to get themselves organized. Was it that? It does become controversial. And the controversy, according to what I read, is that some of the scholars are looking at it, and church officials are looking at it and saying, I don't know whether I like this so much. Let's put it a couple hundred years after the Gospels. I don't want this to kind of be something that you think is formative before the Gospels. So it became controversial. The more any group based their current practice on the assertion that they are doing or preaching what was done by either Jesus or the apostles, the more they will be antagonized by the Didache. Now, I don't have an answer. I'm not going to explain that because I'm hoping that's going to be explained by our study. Why would it be so challenging?
I mean, we will study it, but it's particularly by the Reformation. You have both groups, the Catholics and the Protestants, and realize there's not much interaction at this point in time with the Greek Orthodox. They're both laying claim to what the early church did. Okay, so Protestants were saying we're going to strip Scripture away, and we're just going to go back to the original text of what the early church had, and we're going to be like the early church. And the Catholics said we're doing what the early church did because we have this apostolic succession. We know exactly what was happening. Neither one, at that point in time, could lay claim to what was happening in the Didache in terms of its training. And so it threw their traditions for a loop, which is why, as Mark's saying, something like the Lord's Supper. One party would say, okay, this must be a late thing because that's not how we do the Eucharist. Or one would say, this is an early thing, this is how we do it. So instead of just looking at it for what it was, this controversy develops about why it might actually not be as important as it actually is. Because that's how institutions go.
Yeah. So they developed their own way of thinking about it and didn't like it if the Didache kind of challenged that.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Probably answering the question, what is the Didache? This should be obliged. Start by looking at what we think it means to call someone a Christian. So what I want to say here in reference to this is, scholars are looking at it and saying, if you kind of seeing a Christian as being this or this, then the Didache is going to have a different kind of impact on you. So the model A of a Christian, if one thinks of being a Christian as primarily an individual's option, as it is for most people today, then one picks Christianity because one likes some of its ideas, because one thinks them true, or one likes what Christians do. If this is your model, then the teaching you would want is about what Christians believe, or the teachings of Jesus. So it's that side that focuses on the belief side. It would be that side that's focusing on the stories of Jesus, where Jesus is kind of expressing belief. And then the other side, however, if you think that Jesus came to form a new people, to establish a group, to how way that people as a community, and not just a collection of individuals, can go to the Father, then how the group is to behave, and how do you as a member of the group, how you as a member of the group should behave, became as central to being taught to be a Christian as knowing the stories about Jesus. So that's the one which says that you're talking about a community of people who are going to act in a certain way. So it's a kind of more of a belief group and more of a, this is the way you're supposed to behave. This is what you're supposed to believe. This is the way you're supposed to behave. I'm not using that in any way as in a modern context. What I'm saying, this is what they were trying to do to give some kind of understanding to the Didache. Does that make sense? Yeah, no? So this is the thing that kind of comes through. That the Didache kind of represents an apprenticeship. That what does it mean to become a Christian for those in early church times? Being a believer is more akin to seeking to join a community rather than simply giving assent to a set of teachings or expressing a personal preference. It is not simply a moment of conversion or baptism. To join a new community took time. So it's not a one-shot deal. You have to be, if you're interested in joining the Christian community, being part of the way, then it was something that you had to work at. It's not something that is just something that happens as a result of being baptized or being converted. So what you had to do, one had to learn how to live this new lifestyle. One had to be shaped and formed. One had to be gradually initiated into its values and activities, as well as its beliefs. One learns slowly by learning to belong. One has to show the group that one's initiation is taking place. So people becoming Christian had to have mastered the training on how the group lived. That's what the apprenticeship, and so in one way, if you want to call it a manual, it wasn't a manual just for clerics. It was a manual for everybody. The Didache was something every Christian should know. So, as Todd mentioned, they were to commit it to memory.
And it's highly likely at this time there are no clerics.
Right. Because that's what they said. Well, they found it in 1873. That's when there was a lot of clerics, so the clerics decided it's a cleric man.
So it's likely that, during a time of house worship, persons whose house you were in would lead the activities or the event of what was going on. And so that's why it was so important that everybody know and be trained. It was a lay-led faith. Certainly there would have been, because we know from Paul that there were certainly apostles who would go and lead times of prayer and worship, etc. But at the time of the Didache, you don't have established clerics.
In fact, I remember reading time in the book is that back during Paul's time, there are these people that are coming around acting like they're apostles or acting like they know. And I forget what the thing is in one of Paul's letters that don't feed these people.
Right.
Because if they want food, that kind of means that they're looking to kind of make this into a living. They're trying to bum off you. And so if these people are coming and kind of preaching stuff that is supposedly about Jesus and his teachings and how to live, be careful. We're going to talk about that in a second.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that people at this time, most of them did not know how to read. And so this memorization had to take place verbally.
Yes, yeah, and so one of the things is the idea that you're an apprenticeship, and that eventually leads you to a point of being a mentor, which means that you've learned it, and that you then you're able to teach it to other people.
And we're led to believe through what's in the text that was the process. You would have a mentor who would work with you. And you could have male or female mentors. As the author points out, it's highly likely that women could teach women, but not men, but men could teach both. But you had mentors, and that's how you learned this. And a mentor would help you memorize the Didache, particularly if you could not read.
So what is the Didache? What is the teaching? It is the basic information about the Christian group's lifestyle and their activities as the new people of the way of life. So we all know that, basically know that if you became a Christian, you're sometimes called following the way. Once one has absorbed this teaching, one had finished one's own apprenticeship and was ready to enter fully into the body of Christ. Then, having mastered the teaching, one was in a position, without reading books or anything else, to act as a mentor in the process of shaping others as apprentice Christians. It's pretty rigorous.
Yeah.
Which we'll see. We're going to look at. Next week, I'm going to add this a little bit. Like next week, we're going to just pursue this a little bit further. Why is the Didache important? And it should be, what does it show us? I guess that's what the manuscript looked like. So, rendering that. So, we're just going to one part of the Didache you have in front of you. So basically it says there's two ways. The way of life is the way of life or the way of death. And the differences between these two is great.
And it starts out that way.
You see it right there.
There's
There's no messing around.
There's no introduction.
Bang!
There's no,
Bang!
here's your choice.
Yeah. So the way of life is this. We're going to look at that first a little bit. So, see, you can look at this and say, okay, I'm reading the Gospels. Thou shalt love first the Lord thy Creator, and secondly thy neighbor as thyself, and thou shalt do nothing to any man that thou wouldst not wish to be done to thyself. They hit you right away. No stories, no commentary. This is it. And it gets the Great Commandment, and then gets the Golden Rule kind of worked into one right there.
Yeah, can't argue with it at
No,
all.
no.
So just stop for a moment. This is where it begins. Recall how important those two teachings are in the Gospels, and consider that this may predate those Gospels. So from the very outset of this community, this is what they understood to be the most important thing, without having the Gospel tell them. Right?
Yeah, so again, what I was thinking is, all right, so these Gospel readers, if they have a Didache, they see that, and then they're saying, okay, well, let me see what I can recall the story of Jesus telling me that. Yeah.
Now, in the Gospels, with the Golden Rule, I guess as I've memorized it, the very last part is not there. Is it actually in the Gospels, the not wish to be done to thyself?
So that's the interesting thing about the Didache. It's that it's the negative
Goes in
version.
more detail?
No, there's
It's the balance.
yeah.
Okay.
But most of the Gospels give you the positive description.
So that last part.
Yeah.
Okay. I was wanting to quick look through them and see
what
it was.
That's what it said, yeah.
What was the positive thing it said? What are you thinking
Well, just the do unto others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I memorized as a kid is the Golden Rule.
Yeah.
And I don't remember, shall do nothing to any man that thou wouldst not
Yeah.
wish to be done
No,
to
it's-
myself. I don't
of? That
remember.
really tells it better, doesn't it?
What goes, yeah.
Well, that's just how the Didache and its teaching uses the negative as opposed to the
But I'm
positive.
saying, I think that's better.
Yeah, it's not subject to
What-
interpretation.
No,
In
it's not.
the Confucian text, it's usually found in the negative.
Huh.
Right. Thank you for backing me up there. I didn't know if I was making that.
I was thinking that was going to say
Okay.
something about it.
I thought I was remembering, so but it's also they usually don't appear together
No.
in the Gospels. They're usually separate stories.
I mean, I'm thinking of what we studied last year. I mean, both of them are on the Sermon on the Mount, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah, but they're not.
But they're not right together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
It's not like a succinct teaching where Jesus says, love God, love your neighbor as self, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's not like a phrase or sentence that comes out of his mouth according to the Gospels.
Yeah, so Matthew 7:12 says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. But I am struck. I mean, think about this. This is the one that hits you right between the eyes. It's the first one that they you want to follow the path of life. This is it.
But
Right.
the other thing is, this is all about how one behaves. This really isn't a belief statement. Okay, so, I mean, there is some belief stuff in the Didache, but it's really about how one lives. If you believe in God, and you believe in Jesus, that's sort of, not necessarily believe, but if you have faith and if you trust, we're going to accept that now this is how you're going to live. And so it really becomes, from the very beginning, a training manual of how you are to live. The first thing you do is you love God, you love your neighbor as self, and you do nothing to anyone that you wouldn't want them to do to you.
So anyone this is being taught to already believes. It's not an evangelical type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but belief would be a different, I think it would be different than how we use belief. In other words, they already have faith in God somehow, some way, that they're now interested in becoming baptized, most likely. And this is then how you are to live.
And I guess
because everybody believed in a God back then.
And this is close enough to Jesus' life too that they probably have relatives or friends who can at least your generation or
Yeah,
something.
well, I remember him saying that kind of thing.
Yeah, Grandma told me this.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
And were most of these Jews?
Yes. Okay.
Probably.
I don't think, this was written in Greek.
Yes, well, but everything, most written record
I
by
was
the time.
wondering if it was also going to the Gentile population too.
It is. Primarily because we know that there seems to be some overlap between Paul and the Didache. So I don't want to say it was exclusively to the Jewish community. It's highly likely that at the very beginning there was a significant amount of Jews who were doing this, who were following this new way, which is why it's called the way.
Wouldn't they be working to try to connect it to Jewish law in any way? I mean, is there some?
Well, as we read, we'll see where there is some of that.
Yeah.
But there's also that great God-fearing crowd that's around, and the next question we have to decide is what's the significance of baptism to this community? We now view baptism as a sign of conversion. That culture never saw it as a sign of conversion, at least early on. In other words, John's baptism was a baptism of cleansing. Right? And so, was it really the baptism of conversion at this time? The Eucharist, Lord's Supper, was clearly not what we describe it as today. So it's all sort of different. So it's hard to kind of put the finger on was this a Jewish thing, Gentile thing, both.
The thing is, when you look at it, it's got the Ten Commandments listed. You know,
Yeah.
it's there. You know, it's not they're ignoring Mosaic law.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
there's none of that. I mean, they
Yeah.
see that there's a continuation here,
Yeah.
but I just don't know, in not studying enough, like what context we know that this was found and what other teachings was it found. Like we know that the early church, like Clement and others, referenced the Didache, so we know that for them that was important. Clement was Gentile and so forth. So we know it was eventually used in different settings. The very first, yeah, maybe it was just a strictly Jewish community.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about the fact. I mean, I'm just positing here. If I'm a Jew at this time, and I'm going to synagogue, and I know my best buddy or somebody I know has been part of the community for a long time, he's kind of acting a little bit differently in a very, very positive kind of way. I wonder why. I wonder why he's acting that way. And it might be that he is looking at the Didache, and his life is one of being more than an apprentice, maybe as a mentor. So I'm just thinking that from synagogue to synagogue, I would expect that there were some people that were looking at this and obviously thinking that Jesus was who he was, or maybe not, but they're at least following. Attempting to follow the Didache, which then makes other members of the synagogue who are not. Well, why are you doing this? And you can quote. You can say, "This is why I'm doing it. Here's what I'm reading. Here's what I'm not reading. Here's what I've got. I know." Kind of thing. Does that make sense?
I have a difficulty myself because reading this is, for me, a different interpretation personally than reading that. So why is that different from this in the wording, in the order of wording? And why I say that is because when I saw that, thou shalt love first the Lord thy creator, meaning you love the Lord creator above everything else, which is why the rich man, the parables about you give up everything, and this is just say, the way of life is this. First, comma, you love God. I mean, this to me is more powerful. Are these the same? What is this translation we're reading?
Well, that's a good question.
I'm asking why
you.
is this? Which is the original, Todd?
Well, this is coming from the text. In other words, the book.
So this is.
So what you have is what you have. That's the actual printing
Wording?
of the Didache. Yes.
This is the actual translation.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I wonder
I don't
which was
think
the actual.
I'm not
Because
sure
I really
what it
do
is.
interpret the two for myself a little differently.
Well, tell me about that.
What makes it?
Yeah,
What makes the Didache's version more powerful for you?
And this is the Didache's version.
That what you have in your
We're looking
hand
at
is the
1.2.
Yeah, that's what I'm confused
Are
on.
you
This
looking
is
at
not the Didache's version.
Right.
Okay,
That's just how the author condenses.
okay, that to me is more powerful than this.
Correct.
I don't know if that's true for the rest of it.
That's all.
Yeah.
You shall love God. And to me, the first, you love God first is really important. Like above family, that right away goes to above children, above family to me.
Uh-huh.
And this is you love God, but you also love your family. And this to me is an ordering.
Right.
You do this and this and this, as opposed to the importance of it, the moral importance or whatever.
Well, but consider the difference between someone orally telling you this
Mm-hmm.
and then writing it down.
Yeah, that's the difference too.
Right? So if you're hearing it orally, you might hear it more along the lines of like how Mark laid it out on the slide as opposed to how it's written down.
And an oral speaker can emphasize
Right.
what is
So,
important in the way they
I
speak
didn't
the
realize that.
language.
That's what this guy's doing.
Yeah.
Obviously. Yeah.
So this is more emphasizing maybe what a speaker would be emphasizing. So that's interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a challenge with any text when you try and put them down on paper. I mean, I can, from my own experience of preaching, the biggest struggle is learning how to write how I talk,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so it's now reversed for this sort of thing. So you're talking, and then you've got to write it down. Well, once you start writing it down, it becomes like an intellectual pursuit. And so you make sure, okay, there's comma goes there.
So Coglin's not writing it word for word, but he's kind of synthesizing. So look at this. This one is 1:3. If you look at 1:3, let's read what 1:3 says. The training about these words is this. It's interesting. The training about, so that's not even there. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who are your enemies. Do fast for those who persecute you. What benefit is it if you love those who love you? Do not even the Gentiles do that? Rather, you must love those who hate you. And so you are not to treat the other person as your enemy. So, what Coglin's done here is just to say, what you may learn from these words is to bless them that curse you, to pray for your enemies, and to fast for your prosecutors. For where is the merit in loving only those who return your love? Even the heathens do as much as that. But if you love those who hate you, you will leave nobody to be your enemy. So it's interesting in terms of the contrast to those two. So it would seem to me that because he's synthesized, this is where I would come down, it feels more powerful. He's leaving out a lot of the other little stuff in between. How does that feel to you? Is that true for you?
So who wrote this, Todd?
The author.
Yeah, this guy.
So this isn't just a question of translation. The
It's not a
translation.
translation then.
It's interpretation.
It's his
It's
interpretation.
his
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
interpretation. The
But this is the
translation.
point I have.
The actual translation is what
This
you
would be accurate, or
Yes.
would
Yeah.
different people translate?
No, that's an accurate
But this is the
translation.
real teaching.
That's a
Yeah, that's
translation.
exactly
The text that you've been given, the print up of the Didache, is a translation that, not universally, but it's an established translation.
Oh, okay. It makes me, this is a little aside, but in Arabic music, which is improvised, they can improvise for half an hour on the 3 words, I love you, by the inflection of which word is important. And it's the listener that hears it, I love you, or I love you. And they can take this, and that's exactly what this is sort of. It's the speaker or the singer that is, emphasizing what is the important message being carried. I think this is really interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go back because I think that this isn't Coglin's translation. I think I looked the Didache up, online, and this is what I got. So I might,
Which would have been probably a synthesized version.
Yeah, a synthesized version. Exactly.
The word Didache, I think, sounds to me like it's the same root as didactic.
Yes,
Mhm.
exactly.
And this is didactic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's taken from the Greek. What was the great didactic sort of teaching in the Greek was
Yeah.
Socratic method. So
Exactly.
it's all about sort of that framework of training.
That is not didactic.
No, that's
No.
right.
So that's,
Interesting.
it is interesting. Okay, thank you. I really
Yeah, no, that's a
didn't
good
get the
point.
difference.
So that it's going to now go into some stuff that's specifically on the list here. I don't know whether this is going to be open for interpretation. Beware of carnal appetites of the body. I'm looking for where that is actually on the list here. Is it 4?
Or,
Yeah, okay. So abstain from carnal desires. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other one to him as well, and perfection will be yours. So that reads, if someone strikes your left cheek, then turn the right cheek towards them also, and you will be perfect.
so they reversed the right and left for some reason.
Yeah.
So what hand is the dominant hand?
Right.
And if somebody's across from you and they go slap you, what side are they in?
You're gonna strike me off.
So in other words, it's really, you're going to get hit first on the left. So it's then giving the right as an option as well. Which is what then?
So
It's
why
back.
would they change it? I mean, that's just so interesting to me, that somebody felt it could be changed.
Yeah.
It's just interesting.
Well, because it takes away, so to get hit on the right is what? It would be a backhanded slap, right? Which is more of an insult.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't there something in Jewish law too as to which side you hit? Or custom?
Sure.
Right?
I'd have to look that up.
Okay.
That might have something to do with it. But it's just, I'm finding this so interesting that it's.
Well, I'm quite interested in terms of the different ways that it can be interpreted. Yeah. And even the Didache is interpreted. Yeah, by people as they.
Maybe this author was left-handed. I was thinking,
Well-
Nancy, you said it, I thought it.
But the problem then becomes, okay, so think about this. So, you need the check. How does it appear in the Sermon on the Mount? Because I do think it's pretty prominent that it leads with you get struck on the right cheek, give you the other cheek as well. So who at the point in time decides to, if the Didache's first, who at the point in time decides to change that?
No.
So there's an editorial decision made at that point in time. And then it gets picked up. And then tradition takes it so much that it's just difficult to go back to the original. Because I don't think most of us, when we consider it, we would think automatically it's the right cheek. Or just the sheer fact that when it was read left, everybody was sort of like, what? Like, that doesn't sound right. So in other words, that's the tradition that we've grown accustomed to. But was that necessarily the earliest teaching, or is that what develops over time and then it just becomes a snowball and nobody really goes back and checks it? But that's the issue with some of, and this is the challenge of the Didache. Because, and the argument over dating of it.
Well, isn't that the challenge in the scripture as well? I mean, isn't that always kind of the challenge?
Yes and no. Like, scripture and scripture's translation changes a little bit, but not a lot. But just in this one instance, changing it from left to right is really significant. It's just not a matter of a side, but it really changes the meaning. Because it's really not possible. I mean, there's some people who have said that since the person's being struck on the right cheek, that means that it's the backhanded slap, right? Which is an insult. The natural inclination when you hit someone is to go that way. And so I would be inclined to think that it's the left cheek that's going to get hit first.
We're trying to find that, and I can't find it. So that's part of that one too, right?
Yeah.
If someone makes you go the mile, then go the extra mile.
What's that about? I don't relate to that at all.
Yeah.
So, the way we translate it from the gospel story, was that a Roman centurion could require you to carry their items for a mile. And so we frequently, when we talk about interpreting the Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus is saying that if somebody requires you to do it for a mile, go the extra mile. Which in other words is, in a way it's saying, okay, the initial demand is a demonstration of oppression. The person willingly do it was a way of you saying you are not oppressing me.
It's like you're taking control.
Right.
This is what I'm going.
And that's what a lot of what the Sermon on the Mount was, turning the other cheek, going the extra mile, giving your cloak. You know, the one for giving the cloak is that not only do you give him the cloak, which is your outer garment, but you give him your other garment, so it leaves you naked. Except for a loincloth or something. And that is to demonstrate to the crowd that the person who has demanded this of you is oppressing you and has no moral being. It's to embarrass the person. So it's not like, oh, there's a homeless person, I'm going to give him my coat and my other garments. That's not what it's about.
For me, Al, the way I read that is if I am helping somebody to go a mile, they need my assistance. Okay? This is how I would interpret for myself. When you're done your responsibility, don't think that you're done your responsibility. That person who needed help probably needs more help. So extend yourself further. That's just,
The only problem with that is if you're going to stick with that language, you're being compelled to do it.
Compelled.
So it's
It's
not
not
a
choice.
voluntary action.
It's not choice. Okay, that's fair. That's fair. That passage from Matthew on the cheek, I'm going to just read it. It's Matthew 5:38-40. If you've heard that I was what I have said, if you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. So that's really the next one.
And we can kind of not argue, but discuss like the differences. But take a step back. Here these items are in the Didache, and it definitely predates Matthew. Okay, and it's very much at the beginning of the Didache. Right. So these are the significant teachings or trainings for the early believer. Now, the other book that I have yet to send to Mark, but I have to, points out that one of the reasons why turning the other cheek is lifted up at the very beginning is because that's the assumption that the novice, that's what they're going to experience. They're going to be persecuted by those around them. Could be family, could be social friends, as they pursue the way. And so the first thing that a novice needs to be taught is turn the other cheek. Again, that's just what one author reasons.
I immediately go to Martin Luther King and civil disobedience and, the non-violent, demonstration. Wow.
Yeah. Well, that's what we turn the other cheek in. I mean, was that necessary?
I don't know, they have it.
I know, it's just.
It's probably not in
Did
there.
you think the same thing?
That's a very interesting, yeah.
If anyone seizes anything belonging to you, do not ask for it back again. You could not get it.
Here it says you are not allowed to ask for it back.
Yeah, that's quite different.
That's very different.
Give to everyone that asks without looking for repayment, for it is the Father's pleasure that we should share His gracious benefit with all men. So I'm really struck by Todd's statement of the novice who is looking at these statements. Are you crazy? I'd say that. So you're gonna live like this? Really? Oh. A giver who gives freely, as the commandment directs, is blessed. No fault can be found with him. Without reading there.
We need to wrap up.
Yep, got it. Go to right there. We'll stop there. That's a start.
Yeah, no, this is great.
No, I would read it as, you know, if you want to read the whole thing, go ahead. And we'll take a look at particular sections in a little more detail, or if there are areas that, when we get to, that are particularly challenging, or something I had a question about, we can stop and spend some time on. But it really is interesting to read it through.
And I think it's interesting to coordinate it with what is in, say, Matthew.
Yeah. That's probably the best text to look at. I mean, we often talk about how Matthew is writing with, he's got Mark in one hand, he's got, you know, the Q source, whatever that is, you know, in the other hand, and then maybe he has the Didache there as well, and he's weaving it all together.
Great, thanks.